Hello, grade 8s. We are starting chapter 4 today, and we're talking about percents. You'll notice on this screen, I'm looking at page 122 in your textbook, and you can see there's a can here that someone has gone to the grocery store to buy. People often read nutrition labels on food products to determine the percent of the recommended daily value. That's the RDV. Of nutrients the food contains. By reading these labels, you can make wiser food choices to maintain body health. And most of the times, if you go to your cupboard and you look at a can, these numbers are given in percents. Look on the lower left-hand side of your textbook, actually kind of the middle. A percent means that it's out of 100. Right? So we're talking about a ratio or a fraction that's out of 100. Another name for percent, we can say hundredths. And then it says 65% here means 65 out of, we can write it like this as a fraction, 65 out of 100. When you do that division, you could type it into your calculator, or you could remember that when we divide by 100, we move the decimal over 2 spots to the left. So we get 0.65. These are all equal. 65% is equal to 65 over 100, which is equal to 0.65. Now, a lot of times when we're talking about percents, we use 100 grids or 100 charts. So let's move down here, and we're going to start talking about hundreds charts. The 100 grid shows 100%, right? Right here. This fills in all green. We can count them. There's 10 squares across and 10 squares down. So 10 times 10, there's 100 squares in this 100 grid. How many of these squares are shaded? Well, let me get my pen out. 100 of them are, right? 100 squares shaded green. Okay, how many squares need to be shaded to represent 25%? Remember, 100% of these squares are shaded, and 100 are shaded, 100 out of 100 are shaded here. Or another way we could write that in decimal form is 1.00. All of these, one whole, are shaded. Or we could write that in percents as 100% of this box is shaded. Okay, let's look at 25%. Pause it and color in or imagine 25 of these hundreds shaded. If I grab my crayon, there's 10 here. 10, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 25 out of 100. So that blue would be 25 squares out of 100, which is the same thing as writing 25%, which is the same thing as writing 0.25. Okay, and let's move to the next slide. Okay, if we think of shading 2% of this 100 grid, 2% is 2 out of 100, so we would just shade 2 boxes. Let's think about this next one. How do we shade 0.75%? So less than 1 out of 100. So here we've got one square, and we've divided one square into 100. Okay? So this tiny square, we've zoomed into it, and if there's 100 little pieces of this 1 out of 100. Okay, now let me get my crayon back here. Let's choose green this time. 0.75. We know it's less than 1. If we were to shade very carefully, we could probably shade 0.75 about there. Little white space left over, right? Okay, let's think of 75. That would be all of these, 30, 40, 50, 60, 75. There we go. It looks better in crayon. There we go. Exactly 0.75 out of 100. Right there. So one little square is blown up to show a part of one. Okay, now here's the pictures. What are the answers? Okay, this whole green one, 100 squares out of 100 are shaded, which is 100%. How about this one? There is 4, 5, 6, 7, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29 green pieces out of 100, which is the same as 29%. Okay, what about this one? We can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 by 10. So this is 60 plus a little bit. If we look at this, it looks like 60.5 or 60.5. But let's look at this one square zoomed in and find out how many actually are colored. So we know that it's 60 and a bit out of 100. How much is the bit? Let's count them. 10, 20, plus 9 times 3. So 10, 20, 29, 38, 47. 47 hundredths. Or if we want to write it in parts, let's take that away, and we would have, 60 plus 0.47 out of 100 here equals 60.47 out of 100. If we want to write that with the percentage symbol, 60 ones plus this many hundredths. Let's get back to food percentage labels. So this label I have on the left here, or the right, sorry, is from an orange juice carton. And it says here that 1 cup, you can see at the very top, let me get my highlighter, 1 cup, that's what 250 mils is 120% of your vitamin C intake. That means we want 100% every day. If you drink 1 cup of orange juice, you get more than you need, 120%. So let's fill in the chart here. How do we write 120% on a 100 grid? Well, 100% would be all this first grid. 100 squares plus 20%, right, would be 10 and 20. Now, it doesn't matter which 20 of these squares you fill in. This just needs to represent 20 out of the possible 100 on the grid. Okay, let's turn the next page. Did you know that Canada only has 0.5%? That's less than 1, half of 1. Of the world's population? Interesting. I'm not sure when that stat was taken, but I believe it to be true. How do we represent 0.5%? Okay, we know that it's exactly half of one of these little squares. So maybe this one here. It's exactly half. I'm talking in a high voice for something little. Now, when we want to represent exactly half, we do it this way, and this is an approximation. We know that that's not exactly half. You can see my pen was a little bit wonky there. So we take that one piece of the hundredths chart, and we're going to enlarge it so that this one little square becomes this entire piece. So let's represent now half of that square. And if I would color in half, I would color in that much to be exactly 0.5, exactly 0.5% out of 100. A credit card company charges 18 3/4% interest on unpaid balances. Okay, so let's represent that with 100 charts. Now, 18, we can easily count those whole pieces. This one row is 10 plus another 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, it's a little bit more than 18, right? Not quite 19, so we can't fill in this whole last square. But 3/4, we know how much 3/4 is. We could do an approximation, maybe right there. But to be precise, we're going to take this one square and enlarge it so we can record the 3 out of 4, the 3/4%. Now, go back to my highlighter, and if I would do 3/4 of this, we know there's 100 squares, 3/4 of 100 is 75. So if we think about money and quarters, that makes it easier for us. 4/4 makes a whole dollar, 3/4 would be 75 cents. So let's do 70 plus another 5. Okay, there we go. So this represents 18, and when we blow this or zoom in on that last square, this represents 3/4 of a square. I'd like you to pause it here and represent 180 on these pages. You can think about it, or you could get a piece of graph paper and actually do it on your own. Good. Let's look at 180. Check your answer. Is this what you had? 180 of these squares filled in. Okay, let's erase that and try representing 0.6 on these grids. Okay, we know that 0.6 is less than 1, so we need to take 1 and blow it up or zoom in. Now, 0.6, the 6 is in the tenths spot. So we know we could write this decimal as a fraction 6 over 10. Now, if we think about dividing this hundredths grid into groups of 10, that means each column would be one group, and we need to fill in 6 of these groups. Another way to look at this would be to write this with a 0. We know that 0.6 is the same thing as 0.60. Then the 0 is in the hundredths spot. And we know that we could write as 60 over 100. So we could then fill in 60 individual squares. Okay, so let's fill that in, and that is 0.6%. Pause the video and see if you can draw in 12.5% on these grids. Okay, here's 12. Now it's 12 and a part. So let's take one more piece from this grid and let's blow it up or zoom in, and we'll represent a half. Now, we know that a half, if we would put it into fractions out of 100, we would do 2 times 50 is 100, 1 times 50. This is a half. So it would be 50 of the 100. You can also see it, and let me get the right color here, and draw that in. So half would be 50. There we go, 12.5. Good job with 4.1. You can move on to the assignment.